The most dangerous lies are never hidden in classified files. They are hidden inside the stories everyone believes without asking a single question. My name is Rachel Morgan, and for nearly 15 years I built my career by trusting evidence instead of rumors. I worked as a financial investigator for the Department of Justice, following paper trails that stretched across state lines, shell companies, and international bank transfers. Numbers never lied. People did. That belief had guided every major case I had ever solved until the morning an unmarked envelope appeared on my desk without a return address, a tracking label, or even the name of the courier who delivered it. My office overlooked downtown Washington, D.C., where the early morning sun reflected across rows of government buildings, while commuters hurried toward another ordinary workday. Everything around me felt familiar, predictable, and carefully organized. Then I opened the envelope. Inside rested a thin black folder containing only one sheet of paper. There were no financial statements, no photographs, and no investigative summaries. Just a single sentence printed in plain black ink. If you find the Black Jackal, do not arrest her. Listen first. I stared at the page for several seconds, convinced someone had made a mistake. The Black Jackal was not a person anyone expected to meet. The name had circulated through federal agencies for years, attached to impossible investigations, vanished criminal networks, and anonymous tips that always appeared moments before major financial crimes quietly unraveled. Some believed the Black Jackal led an international organization. Others insisted the name belonged to a ghost invented to distract investigators. Every official report ended exactly the same way. Identity unknown.
No verified photograph.
No confirmed age.
No reliable fingerprints.
No prosecutable evidence. My supervisor entered before I could read the page a second time. He closed the office door behind him and spoke in a voice lower than usual. "Rachel, that folder is yours now. Effective immediately." I looked up in confusion. There has to be more than this. He nodded slowly. There should be. There never is. Before leaving, he added one sentence that unsettled me even more. "If anyone asks what you are working on, tell them it is an accounting review." The door closed, leaving me alone with more questions than answers. I spent the rest of the morning searching secure databases, archived investigations, and intelligence briefings. Thousands of references mentioned the Black Jackal. Almost every document contradicted the one before it. One report described a sophisticated financial criminal. Another suggested an anonymous whistleblower. A third implied the name represented several different people operating across decades. None of the timelines matched. None of the descriptions aligned. It was as though someone had intentionally buried the truth beneath layers of carefully constructed myths. Just before lunch, my encrypted government email chimed with a newly authorized file that had not existed moments earlier. The subject line simply read, "Begin in Chicago." Attached was an invitation to a private charity gala hosted by the Hayes Foundation, featuring prominent business leaders, artists, and philanthropists. At the bottom of the guest list, one name had been highlighted in pale gray, almost invisible against the page. Olivia Hayes. There was no explanation, no photograph, and no indication why her name mattered. Yet something deep inside me whispered that my investigation had not truly begun with the mysterious folder on my desk. It had begun long before anyone decided to place my name on the case. The flight to Chicago lasted less than 2 hours, but by the time the plane touched the runway, I felt as though I had crossed into an entirely different investigation. My official orders described the trip as routine financial oversight connected to a charitable foundation. Unofficially, I had been sent to observe one woman whose name appeared only once inside a carefully prepared guest list. Olivia Hayes. That was all I had. No criminal record. No verified intelligence reports. No explanation for why someone wanted me to find her before anyone else did. The charity gala occupied the grand ballroom of one of Chicago's oldest historic hotels, overlooking the river. Crystal chandeliers illuminated polished marble floors while a string quartet performed quietly near the entrance. Business executives, museum directors, philanthropists, and elected officials moved comfortably through the room, greeting one another with practiced smiles. Nothing about the evening suggested hidden secrets. It looked exactly like hundreds of fundraising events I had attended during previous investigations. I checked my watch as I accepted a glass of sparkling water from a passing server. According to the schedule, Olivia Hayes had not yet arrived. I used the extra time to study the guest list, quietly comparing names against information stored in my memory. Several attendees had donated millions of dollars to educational programs. Others had funded medical research or community housing. Everything appeared legitimate. Yet experience had taught me that appearances often revealed the least important part of any investigation. Just as the orchestra transitioned into another piece, conversations around the ballroom softened almost imperceptibly. Nobody announced a new arrival, yet people instinctively turned toward the entrance. I looked up and immediately recognized the woman from the highlighted name. Olivia Hayes entered without security, photographers, or unnecessary attention. She wore a tailored black evening suit instead of a formal gown, her dark brown shoulder-length hair framing a composed face marked by quiet confidence rather than calculated charm. She greeted hotel staff by name before stopping to speak with a young scholarship recipient and the students' parents, listening with genuine interest instead of polite obligation. That simple interaction did not fit the image I had unconsciously constructed. I watched from across the room, reminding myself that first impressions solved nothing. My assignment was to observe, not conclude. Several minutes later, the event organizer unexpectedly approached me. "Miss Morgan," he said warmly, "Miss Hayes was hoping to meet you before dinner." I felt a brief surge of surprise. I had registered under a different division and had never contacted anyone connected to the foundation. Somehow Olivia already knew I was there. Before I could ask how, the organizer gently guided me toward a quieter gallery overlooking the river. Olivia stood alone beside a large window studying the lights reflecting across the water. When she turned toward me, her expression remained calm, almost familiar. "Rachel Morgan," she said with an easy smile. "Thank you for accepting the invitation." I kept my voice steady. "I do not believe we have met before." "No," she replied thoughtfully, "but I have been expecting you for quite some time." Before I could respond, an elderly museum curator hurried into the gallery carrying a sealed envelope. He apologized for interrupting before placing it directly into Olivia's hands. She glanced at the handwritten message inside only once. The warmth in her expression disappeared for the first time that evening. She folded the note carefully, looked back at me, and spoke in a quieter voice. "It seems someone else already knows you have arrived." Olivia's words followed me long after the gala ended. She never explained how she knew someone else had been tracking my arrival, and I never asked in front of a room filled with strangers. Professional instinct told me that important conversations rarely happened where people expected them. As the guests slowly drifted toward the ballroom for dinner, Olivia excused herself to greet several scholarship recipients, leaving me alone with more questions than answers. I quietly slipped outside onto the hotel's riverfront terrace, hoping the cool evening air would help me think more clearly. Chicago's skyline reflected across the dark water while sightseeing boats glided beneath illuminated bridges. Everything looked peaceful, yet my attention kept returning to the sealed envelope I had seen in Olivia's hands. Whatever message it contained had changed her expression immediately. My phone vibrated before I could organize my thoughts. The message came through an encrypted government application that only a handful of investigators could access. There was no sender listed, only a photograph taken less than 5 minutes earlier. It showed Olivia and me standing together inside the gallery, captured from an elevated angle neither of us had noticed. Beneath the image appeared a single sentence: "Do not mistake observation for protection." Before I could report the message, it disappeared from the application as though it had never existed. I returned inside determined to locate Olivia again, but she had already moved through the ballroom greeting donors, musicians, and volunteers with remarkable ease. Watching her interact with people made my assignment increasingly difficult to reconcile with reality. She listened carefully when others spoke. She remembered names without hesitation. She thanked hotel employees with the same sincerity she showed elected officials. Nothing about her behavior resembled the mysterious figure described in countless contradictory intelligence reports. Late in the evening, the foundation announced a surprise presentation honoring community organizations that had quietly funded financial literacy programs for struggling families. Olivia declined the invitation to stand on stage, and instead encouraged the program directors to accept recognition themselves. The audience applauded warmly while she remained near the back of the room, almost deliberately avoiding attention. That choice stayed with me. Most influential people I had investigated welcomed public recognition. Olivia appeared genuinely uncomfortable with it. As the event concluded, I finally approached her near the coat check. "Someone sent me another anonymous message," I admitted quietly. She studied my face rather than asking to see my phone. "I expected they would," she replied. "The question is whether they want you to fear me or follow me." I frowned. "Who are they?" A faint smile crossed her face, though it never reached her eyes. "If I answered that tonight, you would not believe me." Before I could press further, a young volunteer hurried toward Olivia carrying a leather notebook that had apparently been left behind by one of the guests. Olivia thanked her politely before opening the cover. Tucked inside the first page rested an old newspaper clipping with no date visible. Across the center someone had circled a single headline in red ink. It read, "Anonymous source prevents largest financial fraud in state history." At the bottom, written in elegant handwriting, were 7 words that neither of us had expected to see. The Black Jackal never worked alone after all. The newspaper clipping stayed in my thoughts long after I returned to my hotel room. I placed it beside the anonymous photograph and the single page from my original case file, hoping that if I looked at them long enough they would finally begin making sense together. Instead, every new clue only expanded the mystery. According to every official record I had reviewed, the Black Jackal was supposed to be an isolated figure operating beyond the reach of ordinary investigations. Yet the handwritten sentence suggested something completely different. Someone had never worked alone. Someone had always belonged to a larger story. I barely slept before my secure government phone rang just after sunrise. My supervisor spoke without his usual confidence. He asked whether I had made direct contact with Olivia Hayes. When I answered yes, a long silence followed. Finally, he instructed me to discontinue all unofficial conversations with her and return to Washington immediately after completing a brief financial review of the Hayes Foundation. His sudden change of direction immediately raised my suspicions. Less than 24 hours earlier, my assignment had centered entirely on locating Olivia. Now I was being told to avoid her completely. Before ending the call, he added one final sentence that felt strangely rehearsed. "Remember, some people become convincing by pretending to help." The moment the call ended, I knew I could no longer rely entirely on official guidance. Instead of returning to the airport, I drove toward the Hayes Foundation headquarters to complete the financial review requested in my orders. The foundation occupied a beautifully restored historic building overlooking Lake Michigan, filled with music classrooms, scholarship offices, and community meeting spaces. Staff members welcomed me warmly, answering every financial question with complete transparency. Every donation matched the published reports. Every grant had supporting documentation. Every expense appeared legitimate. I had investigated enough nonprofit organizations to recognize fabricated accounting when I saw it. This foundation showed none of the warning signs. While reviewing archived scholarship files inside a quiet records room, I discovered something unexpected. Several grant recipients had later become forensic accountants, financial investigators, and ethics professors across the country. The pattern felt too intentional to ignore. It was as though someone had quietly invested in building a network of people committed to protecting financial integrity rather than personal influence. As I copied several public records into my notebook, Olivia appeared in the doorway carrying 2 cups of coffee. She smiled gently before placing one beside me without interrupting my work. "I thought investigators preferred coffee over small talk," she said. I could not help smiling back. "Most investigators do." She glanced at the open scholarship files before speaking again. "Have you noticed what all of those names have in common?" I admitted that I had not. "None of them ever knew where the funding truly originated," she replied. "That was always the point." Before I could ask another question, one of the foundation employees hurried into the room holding a sealed archival box that had just been delivered from an off-site storage facility. The label showed it had been requested years earlier but never collected. Olivia carefully lifted the lid. Inside rested dozens of handwritten journals, and one faded photograph showing a group of ordinary people gathered around a conference table decades ago. On the back of the photograph, someone had written a single sentence in blue ink. Every generation chooses one guardian, but every guardian survives because someone chooses to believe them first. The photograph remained on the table long after the foundation employee quietly left the records room. I studied each face one by one, searching for something familiar. Teachers, accountants, lawyers, community organizers, and ordinary volunteers smiled naturally toward the camera, yet none of them appeared wealthy or influential enough to match the legends surrounding the mysterious guardian I had spent weeks chasing. Olivia gently traced the edge of the faded picture with one finger before looking toward the rows of archived journals. People always searched for a single extraordinary person, she said softly. They never imagined the truth could be much simpler. I looked back at the handwritten sentence on the reverse side of the photograph. Every generation chooses one guardian, but every guardian survives because someone chooses to believe them first. The words carried a quiet sincerity that did not feel manufactured. They felt lived. We carefully opened the first journal together. The entries stretched across decades, written by different hands but following the same tradition. Each guardian recorded practical observations rather than dramatic confessions. They documented anonymous donations that saved community programs, financial fraud that had been quietly prevented before innocent families suffered, and scholarships created under different names so recognition would never overshadow the people being helped. Every few pages another person assumed responsibility, continuing the work without seeking attention. I realized that the legend surrounding the Black Jackal had slowly grown larger than the people who had actually carried its purpose forward. While I continued reading, Olivia stepped toward a nearby window overlooking Lake Michigan. Afternoon sunlight reflected across the water, illuminating her thoughtful expression. When my grandmother handed me these journals, she said quietly, she did not tell me to protect a title. She told me to protect trust. Her words lingered in the silence between us. For the first time since arriving in Chicago, I stopped seeing Olivia as the subject of an investigation and began seeing her as someone carrying an unexpected burden she had never asked to inherit. My secure phone vibrated before I could respond. Another encrypted message had arrived without a sender. This one contained no photographs or warnings. Instead, it included a scanned page from an internal Department of Justice memorandum, dated almost 20 years earlier. A single paragraph had been highlighted. It authorized selected officials to preserve the public myth surrounding the Black Jackal, in order to shield confidential financial sources from political interference. I read the paragraph twice before slowly lowering the phone. Someone inside my own department had known the legend served a protective purpose all along. Someone had deliberately allowed investigators like me to believe an incomplete version of the story. I showed the message to Olivia. She did not appear surprised. I was hoping you would discover that yourself, she admitted. Before I could ask why, the foundation's reception desk called to inform her that a visitor had arrived asking specifically for me. Neither of us recognized the name that had been signed into the guest log. Curious but cautious, we walked downstairs together. Waiting in the lobby was an elderly woman carrying a weathered leather briefcase. She smiled warmly the moment she saw Olivia, then turned toward me with unmistakable certainty. Without introducing herself, she carefully placed the briefcase into my hands and said, "Rachel, your name has been waiting inside those papers for much longer than you have been looking for hours." The elderly woman waited patiently while I looked down at the weathered leather briefcase resting in my hands. The brass clasps had faded with age, and the corners showed decades of careful use, yet someone had obviously protected it with extraordinary care. I looked back toward her, expecting an explanation, but she simply smiled with quiet reassurance. "You already know more than you think," she said. "The papers will help you understand the rest." Before I could ask her name, she turned toward Olivia with a warm expression that suggested they had known each other for years. Olivia thanked her softly, and the woman nodded before leaving the foundation without another word. I stood in the lobby watching her disappear into the afternoon crowd until she was no longer visible. "Who was she?" I finally asked. Olivia hesitated before answering. "Someone my grandmother trusted completely. She only appears when the time is right." We carried the briefcase upstairs to a quiet conference room. overlooking Lake Michigan. Sunlight reflected across the water while the city skyline stretched into the distance, creating an almost peaceful contrast to the questions filling my mind. I carefully opened the clasps. Inside rested neatly organized folders, handwritten journals, old newspaper clippings, foundation reports, and one sealed envelope bearing my full name in elegant handwriting. The date on the envelope immediately caught my attention. It had been written almost 12 years earlier, long before I had ever heard the words Black Jackal. My heartbeat slowed as I carefully unfolded the letter. The author explained that several young investigators across the country had quietly been observed throughout their careers, not because they were being recruited into a secret organization, but because they consistently chose integrity over personal advancement. My name appeared among them. Every major case I had worked, every difficult decision I believed nobody had noticed, every promotion I had almost declined because it conflicted with my principles had somehow been documented by people I had never met. I lowered the letter and looked toward Olivia in disbelief. Someone has been watching my career for more than a decade. She nodded gently. Not to control your future. To see whether you could be trusted with the truth. That answer should have unsettled me, yet strangely it did not. Instead, I found myself wondering how many quiet acts of honesty had shaped my life without my ever recognizing them. We continued examining the remaining documents together. Instead of hidden fortunes or secret codes, the files contained records of scholarships, anonymous legal assistance, financial education programs, and community projects that had quietly prevented countless families from losing their homes or savings. Every page reinforced the same idea. The legendary name had never existed to inspire fear. It existed to protect the people doing good work without exposing them to unnecessary attention. As evening settled outside the windows, Olivia prepared coffee while I organized the files into chronological order. Without saying anything, she placed my favorite blend beside me. I looked up surprised. "How did you know I drink Colombian roast without sugar?" She smiled with quiet amusement. "You ordered it twice yesterday, and you never finished the sweeter blend they served at the gala." The small observation made me laugh for the first time since arriving in Chicago. It was such an ordinary moment that it somehow made everything else feel more real. Just then I reached the final folder inside the briefcase. Unlike the others, it contained only one photograph. It showed me standing outside the Department of Justice on the first day of my career, smiling proudly while holding my identification badge. Written across the back were 8 simple words. "The first test began before you knew it existed." The photograph remained in my hands long after the sun disappeared behind the Chicago skyline. I studied my younger face standing outside the Department of Justice, smiling with the confidence that only someone at the beginning of a career could possess. At that time I believed every important decision would be made in courtrooms, conference rooms, and official investigations. I never imagined that the most significant choices would happen quietly, without recognition, while no one appeared to be watching. Yet according to the files inside the briefcase, someone had been paying attention from the very beginning. I carefully placed the photograph back into its folder before turning toward Olivia. She was standing beside the window overlooking Lake Michigan, her reflection blending with the city lights beginning to appear across the water. "Did you know about this?" I asked softly. She nodded once. "I knew your name had been included years ago. I did not know the details until today." I searched her face for hesitation but found only honesty. "Why did nobody ever tell me?" She smiled gently. "Because trust cannot be measured after someone knows they are being evaluated." Her answer settled over the room with unexpected clarity. Every anonymous decision I had made throughout my career had truly belonged to me because I believed nobody would ever notice. Somehow that realization felt more meaningful than unsettling. We spent the next several hours reading through the remaining journals together. Every generation had recorded the same lesson in different words. The Guardian was never expected to solve every problem alone. The responsibility always belonged to ordinary people willing to support one another without asking for recognition. I finally understood why every intelligence report had failed to identify a single legendary figure. They had been searching for one extraordinary person when the truth had always depended upon many quiet acts of integrity connected across decades. As I closed the final journal, Olivia reached into one of the inner pockets of the briefcase and removed a small folded city map. Colored circles marked libraries, community centers, legal aid offices, music schools, and neighborhood financial education programs throughout Chicago. Thin blue lines connected every location into a carefully organized network. These are not secret headquarters, Olivia explained with a quiet smile. They are places where people chose to help strangers before anyone asked them to. I traced one of the blue lines with my finger until it ended at a community center only a few miles away. They are all connected, I whispered. Exactly, Olivia replied. The legend survived because kindness kept moving from one person to another. Before we could continue, my secure government phone rang. The caller identification displayed my supervisor's direct line. I answered immediately. His voice sounded unusually urgent, but not frightened. He informed me that an internal review had uncovered restricted files showing that several senior officials had quietly protected the Guardian network for years without revealing its existence to most investigators. Then he paused before adding something I never expected to hear. Rachel, you were never assigned to investigate Olivia Hayes. You were assigned to determine whether the two of you could trust each other. The call ended before I could respond. I slowly lowered the phone and looked across the room at Olivia. She had already understood the answer simply by reading my expression. Neither of us spoke for several moments. Then she opened one final drawer inside the conference room cabinet and carefully removed a sealed blue envelope addressed jointly to both of us. Across the front, written in elegant handwriting that had faded with time, appeared a sentence that immediately made my heart race. To be opened only after the Guardians finally stop searching for an enemy and begin searching for each other. The blue envelope rested between us on the conference table for several long moments before either of us reached toward it. Somehow it felt heavier than the weathered briefcase, the journals, or every classified document I had reviewed since arriving in Chicago. It represented something far more difficult than solving a case. It represented the possibility that everything I believed about trust had been quietly preparing me for this exact moment. Olivia gently slid the envelope across the polished wood until it stopped in front of me. You should open it, she said softly. I shook my head. It is addressed to both of us. A faint smile crossed her face. Exactly. Together we carefully broke the aged seal. Inside rested only 3 handwritten pages, preserved with remarkable care despite the passing years. The first page contained a letter written by Olivia's grandmother. She explained that every generation eventually reached a moment when protecting a legacy became less important than sharing its purpose. The greatest danger was never corruption alone. It was allowing fear to convince honest people that they could no longer trust one another. The second page contained a list of names, not famous officials or wealthy benefactors, but teachers, librarians, accountants, social workers, judges, musicians, and volunteers from communities across the country. Beside each name appeared a simple note describing one quiet act of integrity that had changed another person's life. Reading those ordinary stories affected me more deeply than any classified investigation ever had. None of those people expected recognition. They simply chose to do the right thing when someone else needed them most. Olivia quietly folded the second page while I continued reading the third. It contained no names at all. Instead, it outlined one final responsibility. Whenever a guardian believed someone worthy of continuing the tradition, they were never supposed to recruit them. They were only supposed to create opportunities for truth to reveal character naturally. I slowly lowered the letter and finally understood why my investigation had unfolded through conversations instead of confrontations. Nobody had tried to convince me of anything. They had simply allowed me to discover the truth at my own pace. We sat together in thoughtful silence until the foundation receptionist knocked gently on the conference room door. She apologized for interrupting and handed Olivia a small package that had just been delivered without a return address. Unlike the anonymous messages from earlier in the week, this package contained nothing mysterious. Inside rested a simple wooden compass engraved with a single sentence around its outer edge. Direction matters more than speed. Olivia handed it to me without hesitation. Keep it, she said. I think it belongs with you now. I turned the compass slowly in my hands before noticing a folded card hidden beneath the velvet lining of the box. The handwriting matched the letter we had just finished reading. It contained only one question. If tomorrow no one remembered the legend, would you still choose to protect the people behind it? I looked toward Olivia before answering almost instinctively. Yes. She smiled with quiet relief, not because I had given the correct response, but because I had answered without needing time to calculate it. Just then my secure government tablet chimed with a newly released internal memorandum. The classification had been removed only minutes earlier. Across the top appeared one sentence that changed everything once again. Operation Black Jackal officially concluded.
Community Guardian Initiative officially recognized.
The words on the government memorandum should have brought relief, yet they left me with an unexpected feeling of responsibility instead. For years an entire generation of investigators had pursued a legend that officially no longer existed. Now the truth had finally emerged, not as the story of one mysterious individual, but as a quiet network of ordinary people who believed integrity was worth protecting even when nobody applauded their efforts. I looked across the conference room at Olivia. She folded the memorandum carefully before placing it beside the journals as though it were simply another page in a much longer story. Does this change anything for you? I asked. She considered the question for a moment before answering. It changes how people will describe the past. It does not change what still needs to be done tomorrow. Her answer stayed with me as we walked through the foundation later that afternoon. Staff members prepared classrooms for evening financial literacy workshops, while volunteers organized scholarship applications for the coming semester. Children laughed in a rehearsal room where a local youth orchestra practiced for a community concert. Everywhere I looked, I saw people quietly improving someone else's future without expecting recognition. Suddenly I understood why Olivia had always seemed more interested in names than titles. She remembered every volunteer because every person mattered equally within the larger mission. During a break we stepped onto the rooftop terrace overlooking Lake Michigan. A cool breeze carried the sound of distant sailboats while the skyline shimmered beneath the late afternoon sun. For the first time since we met, neither of us discussed investigations, classified files, or hidden traditions. Instead we talked about ordinary things. My parents' small bookstore in Virginia. Olivia's childhood summers spent helping her grandmother organize scholarship events. Favorite places to drink coffee. The teachers who had changed our lives. The conversation felt surprisingly effortless, as though the walls built by uncertainty had quietly disappeared without either of us noticing. As we prepared to return inside, my secure phone received another message from my supervisor. This time there were no coded instructions or vague warnings. He simply requested that I remain in Chicago for several additional days to assist with the public transition of the newly recognized Community Guardian Initiative. Attached to the message was a schedule for a national conference where representatives from universities, nonprofit organizations, and government agencies would officially introduce the program to the public. Olivia read the schedule beside me before smiling thoughtfully. My grandmother always hoped this day would come, she said. She just never expected to see it happen. Before I could respond, one of the foundation interns hurried onto the terrace carrying a small archive box that had been discovered during renovations in the oldest section of the building. She apologized for interrupting before explaining that every document inside appeared connected to the earliest years of the Guardian network. Olivia opened the box carefully. Resting on top was a leather-bound guest register dating back more than 50 years. We turned to the first sign page together. Instead of famous names, every line recorded ordinary citizens who had quietly volunteered their time to teach budgeting classes, mentor students, or support struggling families. Then I noticed something unexpected near the bottom of the final page. One signature had been added only 3 weeks earlier in fresh blue ink. Neither of us recognized the name, but beneath it someone had written a single sentence that instantly transformed a completed story into the beginning of another. Every legacy survives only when someone new quietly decides it is worth continuing. The signature in the old guest register stayed with me long after the archive box had been returned to its shelf. Someone had quietly added their name only weeks earlier, proving that the tradition had never truly belonged to the past. It had continued even while the rest of the world believed it was only a forgotten legend. The following morning the Hayes Foundation welcomed representatives from universities, nonprofit organizations, community banks, and government agencies for the first planning session of the newly recognized Community Guardian Initiative. The atmosphere felt surprisingly hopeful. Instead of guarded conversations behind closed doors, People exchanged practical ideas about financial education, scholarship programs, legal assistance, and community partnerships. Watching them work together made me realize how much time had been wasted protecting myths instead of supporting people. Olivia greeted every guest personally, remembering names and asking thoughtful questions that made each visitor feel valued. She never positioned herself at the center of the room. Instead, she quietly introduced people who could help one another before stepping back to let the conversations grow naturally. I found myself admiring the simplicity of her leadership. She never needed to prove authority because she earned trust first. During a short break, we walked through the Foundation's rooftop garden overlooking Lake Michigan. Early autumn sunlight reflected across the water while volunteers prepared tables for the afternoon workshops below. I thanked Olivia for everything she had shared with me over the past week. She smiled softly before looking toward the city skyline. "I did not give you the truth," she said. "You chose to accept it after discovering it yourself." I laughed quietly. "That sounds exactly like something your grandmother would have written in one of those journals." Olivia's smile widened just enough to reveal a glimpse of the lighter person she had always kept beneath years of responsibility. For a few peaceful minutes we simply stood beside each other without needing to fill the silence. My phone vibrated unexpectedly. It was another secure message from Washington, but this time the attachment contained the complete declassified history of the Guardian network. I opened the first page expecting another collection of official reports. Instead, the introduction contained a handwritten note scanned from the original document. "No system can survive unless ordinary people continue choosing honesty after the headlines disappear." I immediately recognized the handwriting from the journals. We spent the next hour reviewing the archive together, discovering stories that had never appeared in newspapers or government reports. Teachers who quietly prevented student loan fraud. Retired accountants who volunteered weekends helping senior citizens avoid financial scams. Small business owners who anonymously paid overdue utility bills for struggling families. None of them knew one another, yet together they had shaped countless lives through simple acts of integrity. As the afternoon conference came to an end, representatives gathered in the auditorium for one final announcement. Rather than introducing a new director, they unanimously agreed that the initiative would remain community-led, with rotating volunteers guiding local projects instead of concentrating responsibility in one office. The decision reflected everything the journals had taught us. After the applause faded, one of the university delegates approached Olivia carrying a slim envelope that had just been delivered to the registration desk. The front displayed no name, only the familiar Guardian symbol embossed into deep blue paper. Olivia handed it directly to me without opening it. Inside rested a single invitation to a community center dedication scheduled exactly 1 month later, followed by one handwritten sentence that felt both familiar and wonderfully unexpected. "The strongest legacy is not the one you inherit. It is the one you quietly inspire someone else to begin." 1 month passed more quickly than I expected. When I arrived at the new community center on the north side of Chicago, the parking lot was already filled with families, teachers, small business owners, college students, and volunteers carrying boxes of books and financial planning guides through the front entrance. There were no television cameras waiting outside and no grand stage prepared for famous speakers. That seemed perfectly appropriate. Every lesson I had learned during the past several weeks pointed toward the same truth. The most meaningful work rarely happened beneath bright lights. Olivia was already inside helping arrange chairs for the opening workshop instead of greeting guests from the front of the room. She wore a simple navy blazer rather than the elegant suits I had first associated with her, and for the first time since we met she looked completely at ease. When she noticed me, she smiled with the quiet warmth that had gradually replaced the careful distance she carried during our earliest conversations. "You made it," she said. I laughed softly. I had a feeling this was more important than another meeting in Washington. Together we walked through the classrooms where volunteers prepared budgeting lessons for teenagers, retirement planning sessions for senior citizens, and scholarship information tables for parents hoping to help their children attend college. Every room reflected the same idea that had guided the journals across generations. Knowledge became most valuable when it was shared freely. During the dedication ceremony, community leaders spoke briefly about partnership, education, and responsibility. No one mentioned mysterious legends or hidden guardians. They simply thanked neighbors who had chosen to help one another over the years. Somehow that felt far more powerful than any dramatic revelation could have been. After the audience dispersed into smaller workshops, Olivia invited me to see one final room that had not yet opened to the public. It was a quiet reading library overlooking a small community garden, where children were planting flowers with local volunteers. Shelves were filled with books about economics, ethics, history, leadership, and personal finance. Near the center of the room stood a simple wooden table displaying the restored journals, protected inside glass cases so future generations could learn from them. Beside the exhibit rested a small bronze plaque engraved with one sentence: "Integrity becomes a legacy only when ordinary people choose it every day." I stood silently reading those words until Olivia gently placed a familiar wooden compass into my hand. I had almost forgotten she had given it to me weeks earlier. "Keep carrying it," she said quietly. "Not because it points north, because it reminds you why direction matters." I looked at her and realized how completely my understanding of the investigation had changed. I had arrived in Chicago searching for someone I believed I might eventually arrest. Instead, I had found a person whose quiet example had challenged nearly every assumption I carried about leadership, trust, and service. Before I could thank her, one of the student volunteers hurried into the library carrying a small stack of handwritten registration cards completed by the first visitors of the day. "You should see this," the student said excitedly. Curious, we read through the responses together. Many visitors had written about volunteering, mentoring, or teaching financial literacy in their own neighborhoods after attending only a single workshop. The very last card contained just one handwritten sentence: "Today I came looking for answers, but I am leaving with a reason to help someone else tomorrow." The student's handwritten card stayed in my thoughts long after the community center had grown quiet for the evening. I slipped it carefully into my notebook beside the weathered photograph, the small wooden compass, and the first anonymous message that had brought me to Chicago weeks earlier. Looking at them together, I realized they no longer represented separate clues from an unfinished investigation. They had become milestones along a journey that quietly changed the way I understood justice itself. The following morning I met Olivia at a neighborhood cafe before the center opened for another day of workshops. The place was small, filled with the aroma of fresh coffee and warm pastries, while local residents greeted one another by name as they started their day. For the first time since we met, there were no folders waiting on the table between us, no encrypted messages interrupting our conversation, and no hidden archives demanding answers. We simply talked. Olivia told me stories about helping her grandmother organize scholarship dinners when she was a teenager, carefully labeling donated books and setting tables long before guests arrived. I shared memories of growing up in my parents' bookstore, where every customer seemed to leave with more than the book they originally intended to buy, because my mother always believed the right conversation could change someone's direction in life. We laughed at how similar our childhoods had been despite taking completely different paths into adulthood. As we finished breakfast, my supervisor called from Washington. Instead of discussing investigations, he congratulated me on helping establish the Community Guardian initiative and officially offered me a new position coordinating financial education partnerships between government agencies and nonprofit organizations across the country. The promotion came with greater responsibility, but what mattered most was its purpose. For the first time in my career, success would be measured not only by the cases I solved but also by the people I helped prepare before problems ever reached a courtroom. After the call ended, Olivia smiled with unmistakable pride. "You always believed numbers could tell the truth," she said gently. "Now you get to help people understand them before someone else uses them unfairly." Her words carried more encouragement than any formal recognition I had ever received. Together we walked back toward the community center where volunteers were already welcoming another group of families. A teenage student approached us holding a scholarship application with nervous hands, uncertain whether she belonged in the program. Olivia knelt beside her, answered every question patiently, and reminded her that asking for an opportunity was never something to feel embarrassed about. Watching that simple conversation unfold, I understood why generations of journals had focused on ordinary moments instead of dramatic victories. Lives changed quietly, one person at a time. Before leaving that afternoon, Olivia handed me a small envelope sealed with the familiar blue emblem. Inside rested a handwritten note from her grandmother that neither of us had seen before. It contained only one sentence. The day you no longer need a guardian is the day you become one for someone else. I folded the note carefully and looked around the community center filled with conversations, learning, and quiet hope. For the first time since the mysterious envelope had appeared on my desk in Washington, I no longer felt as though I had reached the end of an investigation. I felt as though I had finally found the beginning of the work that truly mattered. Several years have passed since an unmarked envelope quietly appeared on my desk and changed the direction of my life in ways I could never have imagined. Today I still carry the small wooden compass inside my briefcase wherever I travel, not because I need help finding north, but because it reminds me that every meaningful decision begins by choosing the right direction before taking the first step. The Community Guardian initiative has grown far beyond anything Olivia or I expected. Local partnerships now connect schools, libraries, nonprofit organizations, neighborhood banks, and volunteer mentors across the country. Thousands of families have attended financial education workshops, students have received scholarships, and countless people have discovered that asking for guidance is a sign of courage rather than weakness. The remarkable part is that most of them have never heard the old legend that first brought us together. They simply know that someone cared enough to help. That has always been enough. Olivia continues leading the Hayes Foundation with the same quiet humility that first challenged every assumption I carried into Chicago. She still arrives early to arrange chairs before community events begin, still remembers the names of volunteers, and still believes that listening carefully is one of the greatest forms of respect. Watching her over the years has taught me that true leadership is measured less by influence than by the number of people encouraged to believe in themselves. Together we have traveled to universities, community centers, and small towns where ordinary conversations often inspire extraordinary acts of generosity. Every place leaves us with another reminder that kindness spreads further than recognition ever can. Last week we returned to the original foundation building overlooking Lake Michigan to celebrate another graduating class of scholarship recipients. After the ceremony ended and the guests slowly departed, we walked through the familiar archive one final time. The journals rested safely inside their glass cases, the faded photographs remained carefully preserved, and the weathered briefcase that had once carried so many unanswered questions now stood quietly on display as part of the foundation's history. Nothing felt mysterious anymore. Everything simply felt meaningful. Before leaving, I noticed a young volunteer carefully placing a handwritten notebook onto an empty shelf. Curious, I asked what she was doing. She smiled shyly before explaining that every new volunteer had been invited to record one act of kindness they witnessed during the year so future generations would remember that lasting change begins with ordinary choices. I looked toward Olivia, and neither of us needed to say a word. The tradition had already begun growing beyond us. As evening settled across the Chicago skyline, we stepped outside and paused beside the lake where our first honest conversations had started years earlier. The water reflected the city lights just as it had that unforgettable week, yet everything inside me felt wonderfully different. My phone vibrated once before I slipped it into my pocket. It was only a message from one of our newest volunteers sharing photographs from a financial literacy workshop held hundreds of miles away. The final picture showed children, parents, teachers, and neighbors gathered around a single table, smiling together after helping one another complete their first budgeting plans. Beneath the photograph, the volunteer had written one simple sentence. Someone once believed in us, so today we chose to believe in someone else. I smiled, closed my phone, and looked toward Olivia as we continued walking beside the lake. In that quiet moment, I finally understood that the greatest stories are never remembered because one remarkable person changed the world. They are remembered because ordinary people kept choosing hope, honesty, and compassion until those choices became someone else's beginning.